I should have died instead. He sobbed to the gravestone until a voice behind him said, "You still can." The rain came down like bullets that night, each drop hitting the dry earth with the sound of things breaking. Samuel McKenzie knelt in the mud of Boot Hill Cemetery, his knees soaking through his worn pants, his hat brim heavy with water that fell like tears he couldn't cry anymore. The headstone before him read, "Thomas McKenzie, beloved brother, taken too soon," but the words blurred through the storm and the whiskey burning in Sam's chest. 3 years. 3 years since that day in Sweetwater when everything went wrong. 3 years since his own bullet found its mark in the wrong man's heart. 3 years of carrying Thomas around like a stone in his gut, getting heavier with each sunrise he didn't deserve to see. The revolver felt cold and right in his shaking hand. The same Colt .45 that had killed his brother. The same gun that should have stayed in its holster that day when pride got the better of sense and Sam drew on a man who wasn't even reaching for his weapon. Thomas had stepped between them, hands up, trying to make peace like he always did. The bullet that was meant for Jake Morrison went through Thomas instead, clean through his heart, and he died looking at Sam with surprise instead of anger. Thunder rolled across the Texas plains, deep and endless like the sound of that shot, still echoing in Sam's memory. He pressed the gun barrel against his temple, feeling the metal bite into his skin. The rain washed the salt from his face, but couldn't wash the guilt from his soul. He tried everything else: whiskey, work, wandering from town to town like a ghost looking for somewhere to rest. Nothing worked. Nothing made Thomas any less dead, or Sam any less the man who killed him. "Should have been me," he whispered to the headstone, the words lost in the storm. "Should have been me lying there instead of you. You were the good one. You were the one with something to give this world." Lightning split the sky, turning the cemetery white for a heartbeat before darkness swallowed everything again. In that flash, Sam saw his reflection in a puddle by the grave. Hollow cheeks, eyes like empty wells, 3 days of beard on a face that looked 10 years older than its 28 summers. He looked like a man already dead, just too stubborn to lie down. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he said, his voice breaking like a boy's. "I'm so damn sorry. I try to live with it. I try to make it right. But I can't. I can't carry this anymore." His finger found the trigger. Such a small thing, that piece of curved metal. Such a small movement that would end 3 years of waking up wrong. 3 years of seeing Thomas fall every time he closed his eyes. 3 years of being the man who destroyed the only good thing in his life. The wind picked up, bending the grass around the headstones and making the old wooden crosses creak like ship masts. Sam had chosen this spot because it was far from town, far from anyone who might try to stop him or clean up his mess. He figured he owed the world that much to end this quiet, alone, without making anyone else carry the weight of finding him. He thought about their mother, dead these 5 years from the fever. Maybe she was waiting somewhere with Thomas. Maybe they were both disappointed in what Sam had become. Maybe death would be like walking into a warm house after being lost in the cold for too long. Maybe Thomas would understand. Maybe he would forgive. "I should have died instead," Sam sobbed to the gravestone, the words torn from his chest like something alive, trying to escape. The rain soaked through his shirt, through his skin, down to his bones. He felt emptied out, hollowed like a burned tree, still standing but dead inside. That's when he heard it, a voice behind him, quiet but clear enough to cut through the storm. "You still can." Sam spun around, the gun still in his hand, but pointing down now. Through the sheets of rain, he saw a figure standing maybe 20 feet away, dark clothes making them almost invisible against the storm. He couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, couldn't make out a face, but something about the way they stood, patient, unafraid, made his hand stop shaking. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse from whiskey and sorrow. The figure stepped closer, and now he could see it was a woman, small but straight-backed, with long black hair plastered to her head by the rain. Her face was brown, Mexican maybe, with eyes that looked older than her years. She wore a dark dress and a shawl that clung to her shoulders, and she moved through the mud like she belonged there, like she was part of the storm itself. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, her accent soft but her words hard as iron. And I know who you are, Samuel McKenzie. Sam's grip tightened on the gun. How do you know my name? Because I've been looking for you. She stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough that he could see the water running down her face, could see that her dark eyes held their own kind of pain. I know what you did 3 years ago. I know about your brother. I know about Jake Morrison. The name hit Sam like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud since the trial, since the judge called it justifiable and let him walk free while Thomas stayed in the ground. What do you want? Elena looked down at the gun in his hand, then back up at his face. I want you to live. Why? The word came out broken, confused. You don't even know me. No, she said, but I know men like Morrison. I know what they do to people who get in their way. She took another step closer, and Sam could see that her clothes were travel-worn, that her boots were caked with more than just tonight's mud. My husband was killed 2 months ago, shot down in the street like a dog. And Jake Morrison was the one who pulled the trigger. Sam felt something twist in his chest, something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't quite despair either. Morrison's supposed to be dead. Word was he died in a jail breakup in Colorado. Word was wrong. Elena's voice carried the kind of certainty that came from seeing a thing with your own eyes. He's alive. He's in Mexico now, near the Rio Grande, thinking no one will follow him there, thinking the past can't catch up to him. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, and Sam felt the ground shake under his knees. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at Elena, then at Thomas's headstone. 3 years of guilt had worn him down to nothing, but now there was something else stirring in his chest, something that felt almost like purpose. Why come to me, he asked. Elena smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held more sorrow than joy. Because you're the only man I know who wants Morrison dead as much as I do. And because the dead don't need your death, Samuel McKenzie. They need your life. The rain began to ease, the thunder moving off toward the east like a promise of morning still to come. Dawn came slow and red over the Texas plains, painting the sky the color of old blood. Sam sat on the edge of his hotel bed in Sweetwater, staring at the gun he'd set on the dresser like it might crawl away if he wasn't watching. His clothes still smelled like rain and graveyard dirt, but inside him something had shifted. The weight was still there, heavy as ever, but it felt different now, like maybe it had a purpose. Elena had walked him back to town in silence, her boots making soft sounds in the mud while his mind turned over her words. The dead don't need your death. They need your life. He'd heard preachers say similar things, but coming from her lips in that cemetery, with Thomas's grave still fresh with rain, it had sounded like truth instead of comfort. She told him to meet her at the livery stable when the sun came up. Said she had horses and supplies. Said they could be in Mexico in 4 days if they rode hard. Said Jake Morrison and his gang were holed up near a town called Esperanza, thinking themselves safe on the other side of the border. Sam picked up the gun and slid it into his holster. The leather was cracked and worn like everything else he owned, but it fit his hand like it was made for him. Maybe it was. Maybe some men were born to carry guns, and some were born to carry Bibles. And Sam had learned which kind he was the hard way. The livery stable smelled like hay and horse sweat and leather oil. Elena was there before him, checking the cinch on a brown mare that looked like it could run all day and half the night. She'd changed out of her wet dress into riding clothes, dark pants, and a white shirt, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. She looked younger in the morning light, maybe 25, but her eyes still carried that old sadness. You came, she said without looking up. Said I would. Sam looked at the second horse, a bay gelding with good shoulders and clear eyes. This one mine, if you're willing to earn him. Elena straightened up and faced him. Morrison didn't just kill my husband, Samuel. He burned our farm, ran off our cattle, killed our dog just for the joy of it. All because Carlos wouldn't sell him our land for half what it was worth. Sam adjusted his hat, feeling the morning sun already starting to bite. Why didn't you go to the law? Elena's laugh was bitter as black coffee. The sheriff in our county was Morrison's cousin. The judge owed Morrison money. The law only works when honest men are holding it. She swung up into her saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since before she could walk. Sometimes you have to make your own justice. They rode south through country that got drier and meaner with every mile. The grass gave way to scrub brush and cactus. The trees twisted down to nothing but thorns and stubborn roots. The sun climbed higher and hotter, turning the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe it. Elena rode like she was part of the horse, never fighting the animal, but moving with it like water over stones. Sam found himself watching her more than the trail, wondering what kind of woman left everything behind to hunt killers across 2 countries. Wondering what kind of man her husband had been to inspire that much loyalty. "Tell me about Carlos," he said when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that was more mud than water. Elena knelt by the stream and cupped water to her lips. He was gentle. Too gentle for this country, maybe. He believed people were good until they proved otherwise. He thought Morrison would honor a handshake deal. She splashed water on her face, washing away some of the dust. "I told him Morrison was a snake, but Carlos said every man deserved a chance to do right." "Sounds like my brother," Sam said. The words came out before he could stop them, and he felt that familiar twist in his chest. "Tell me about Thomas." Sam looked out at the desert, at the heat shimmer dancing over the rocks like ghosts. "He was everything I'm not. Patient, kind. Never saw a fight he couldn't talk his way out of. Never met a person he couldn't find some good in. He kicked at a stone with his boot. The day he died, he was trying to make peace. Morrison had been drinking, shooting his mouth off about how he was going to take our ranch one way or another. I got mad, told him to try it. Morrison went for his gun, and I went for mine. But Thomas stepped in. Thomas stepped in." Sam's voice cracked on the words. He thought he could stop it with just his hands and his voice. Thought he could save us both. Instead, he caught my bullet meant for Morrison. Elena stood up and walked over to where Sam sat on a fallen log. She didn't touch him, didn't offer empty comfort, just stood there sharing the weight of it. "Morrison laughed," she said quietly, "when he shot Carlos. Laughed like it was the finest joke he'd ever heard." They rode on through the afternoon, the silence between them not empty but full of shared understanding. 2 people who'd lost the thing they loved most to the same kind of evil. 2 people carrying the same weight, but carrying it together now. As the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert gold and purple, Elena pulled up her horse on top of a ridge. Below them spread a valley with a small town nestled in its center, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. "San Miguel," she said. "We'll rest here tonight. Tomorrow we cross the Rio Grande." Sam looked at the town, at the peaceful way the smoke rose straight up in the still air, at the church bell tower catching the last light. It looked like the kind of place where normal people lived normal lives, where they worried about crops and weather instead of guns and graves. "Elena," he said, "what happens after? If we find Morrison, if we kill him, what then?" She was quiet for a long time, watching the light fade from the valley. When she spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "Then we learn to live with what we've done instead of what was done to us." Sam nodded, understanding. They weren't riding toward revenge, not really. They were riding toward something harder and more precious. The chance to put down the weight they'd been carrying and pick up something else. The chance to honor the dead by choosing life. "My husband used to say that time was borrowed," Elena said, nudging her horse forward down the ridge. "That every day was a gift we had to earn." Sam followed her down toward the lights of San Miguel, toward whatever waited for them across the border, carrying his brother's memory like a prayer instead of a curse for the first time in 3 years. The mission of San Rafael stood like a broken tooth against the Mexican sky, its adobe walls cracked and weathered by 100 years of desert wind. Weeds grew through the gaps in the stones, and the wooden cross atop the bell tower leaned at an angle that spoke of neglect and time's slow victory over faith. Sam and Elena crouched behind a cluster of mesquite bushes 50 yards away, watching smoke rise from what had once been the sanctuary. 5 horses, Elena whispered, pointing to the animals tied in the shade of the mission wall. Morrison and 4 others. Sam counted them twice, his stomach tight with the kind of fear he hadn't felt since that day in Sweetwater. But this was different from the hot rage that had made him draw too fast and aimed too careless. This was the cold fear of a man who finally had something to lose again. They'd crossed the Rio Grande at dawn, following tracks that led through alkali flats and arroyos carved deep by flash floods. The trail had been easy to follow, 5 shod horses heading south, taking their time like men who believed they were beyond pursuit. Elena had been right about Morrison thinking himself safe on this side of the border. "I count 4 rifles," Sam said, studying the mission through the wavering heat. 2 men on the walls, 1 in the bell tower, 1 by the horses. "Where's the 5th?" That was the question that made Sam's skin crawl. 5 horses for men visible. Someone was waiting inside, probably Morrison himself, probably expecting exactly what was about to happen. Elena checked her rifle for the 3rd time, her dark eyes hard as flint. She'd barely spoken since they'd picked up the trail that morning, and Sam could feel the anger radiating off her like heat from a stone. This close to the men who'd killed her husband, she was more wolf than woman. "We should wait," Sam said. "Come back after dark when we can't see what's waiting for us." "No." Elena's voice was flat, final. "Carlos has waited long enough." She was already moving, staying low behind the scattered rocks that dotted the approach to the mission. Sam cursed under his breath and followed, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt. The gun felt heavier than it had 3 days ago, weighted with the memory of what it had done and what it might do again. They made it within 20 yards before the first shot rang out. The bullet kicked up dust 2 feet to Sam's left, and he rolled behind a boulder as Elena found cover behind an old wooden cart that had been bleaching in the desert sun for years. "Samuel McKenzie." The voice came from inside the mission, echoing off the stone walls with a sound like laughter. "Been expecting you, boy." Sam's blood turned to ice water. He knew that voice, though he'd hoped never to hear it again. Not Jake Morrison. Someone worse. "Ezra Kane," he called back, his mouth dry as paper. Elena looked at him sharply. "You know him? He was Morrison's partner. Back before." Sam swallowed hard. "Before Thomas." Kane's laughter drifted out through the broken windows of the mission like smoke. "That's right, boy. Old Ezra Kane, the man who taught Jake Morrison everything he knew about killing. The man who watched you gun down your own blood like a fool too proud to think straight." The words hit Sam like physical blows, each one finding the soft places in his heart where the guilt lived. He could feel Elena's eyes on him, could see the questions forming on her lips. "Morrison's dead," Kane continued, his voice moving closer to the doorway of the mission. "Died of the fever 2 weeks ago. But before he passed, he told me all about you, McKenzie. Told me how you might come looking someday, all full of righteous anger and foolish notions about making things right." A figure appeared in the doorway of the mission, tall, lean, dressed in black like a preacher, but carrying a rifle like a soldier. Even at this distance, Sam could see Kane's pale eyes, cold as winter stars. The man who'd been Morrison's teacher in the art of cruelty, the one who'd turned simple greed into something darker. "So here's what's going to happen," Kane said, stepping fully into the sunlight. Behind him, Sam could see the shadows of other men, their guns trained on the rocks where he and Elena hid. "You're going to walk away, McKenzie. Go and climb back on that horse and ride north until you forget you ever heard the name Morrison or Kane or any of this business. And if I don't," Kane smiled, and it was the worst thing Sam had ever seen, "then you're going to watch that pretty Mexican girl die the same way your brother did. Slow and surprised and calling her name with her last breath." Elena's rifle cracked, and Kane dove back into the doorway as his hat went spinning away. "Bastard," she shouted. "You kill my husband." "No, girl," Kane called back. "Morrison killed your husband. I just watched. Same way I'm going to watch you die if this fool doesn't make the smart choice." Sam closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years settle on his shoulders like lead. This was it. The moment he'd been running from since that day in Sweetwater. Another chance to choose between courage and cowardice, between the man he was and the man he could be. In the silence, he could hear Thomas's voice as clear as if his brother was standing beside him. "Every man gets to choose who he is, Sam. Every single day he gets to choose. What's it going to be, McKenzie?" Kane's voice was patient now, almost gentle. You gonna be smart, or you gonna be dead? Sam looked at Elena, saw the fear in her eyes mixed with something else. Trust. She was trusting him to make the right choice, the same way Thomas had trusted him to be better than his worst impulses. The same way he'd failed 3 years ago. But 3 years was a long time to carry guilt. Long enough to learn the difference between the weight of shame and the weight of responsibility. Long enough to understand that some choices echoed forever, and some choices could silence old echoes. Elena, he said quietly, checking his gun one more time. When I start shooting, you run for that side door. The one with the broken lintel. Sam Dash, your husband was a good man. Thomas was a good man. They deserved better than they got. Sam took a deep breath, tasting dust and fear and something that might have been peace. Maybe we can give it to them. He stood up from behind the boulder, his gun in his hand, but pointed at the ground. Kane stepped back into the doorway, rifle ready, that cold smile still playing around his lips. Smart choice, McKenzie. Now, just walk away and dash. I'm not walking away, Sam said, and his voice was steady as stone. I'm walking forward. The first shot shattered the desert silence like breaking glass, and Sam McKenzie finally chose the man his brother had always believed he could be. The gunfight lasted 3 minutes and felt like 3 hours. When the smoke cleared and the last echo died away against the mission walls, 4 men lay dead in the Mexican dust, and Sam McKenzie was still breathing, though barely. Kane's bullet had found its mark, tearing through Sam's left shoulder and spinning him around like a child's toy. But Sam's shot had been true, straight through the heart of the man who'd taught Jake Morrison to kill without conscience. Kane had died with that cold smile still on his lips, as if death was just another joke he'd finally gotten to hear the punchline to. Elena knelt beside Sam in the shade of the mission wall, her hands red with his blood as she worked to stop the bleeding. The other 3 men, Morrison's gang, Kane's students, had fallen to her rifle and Sam's Colt in a storm of gunfire that left the ancient stones chipped and scarred. Hold still, Elena said, tearing strips from her shirt to bind his wound. The bullet went clean through. You'll live if you don't do anything stupid. Sam tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a cough. Doing stupid things is what got me here in the first place. No, Elena said, her voice gentle but firm. Doing the right thing is what got you here. Finally, the sun was setting behind them, painting the mission walls gold and red. Inside the sanctuary, Sam could see broken pews and a cracked altar where generations of faithful had once knelt to pray. The place felt different now, not just abandoned, but somehow clean, like something evil had been burned out of it. Elena helped him sit up against the wall, and he watched her face in the fading light. There was sadness there still, the kind that would never fully leave, but the hard anger was gone. She looked younger somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It's finished, she said, and there was wonder in her voice. Yeah. Sam looked at the bodies scattered in the dust, at Kane's pale eyes staring sightless at the darkening sky. It's finished. They spent the night in the mission, Elena tending a small fire while Sam dozed fitfully against the wall. Every time he woke, she was there, keeping watch with her rifle across her knees. Sometimes he thought he heard voices in the wind, Thomas's laugh, her husband's gentle words, but they didn't sound like accusations anymore. They sounded like blessings. Morning came soft and pink, with a coolness that promised the heat would come later, but wasn't in any hurry. Elena had made coffee from supplies they'd found in the gang's saddlebags, and the smell of it mixed with wood smoke and desert sage to create something that tasted like hope. "How's the shoulder?" she asked, handing him a cup. Sam flexed his left arm carefully, feeling the pull of the bandages. "Hurts like hell, but it works. I'll have a scar." "Scars remind us where we've been," Elena said, settling beside him with her own coffee. "They don't have to tell us where we're going." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled on the thermals, hunting for movement in the rocks and scrub. Sam found himself thinking about time. All the minutes he'd wasted on guilt, all the hours he'd spent wishing he was dead instead of Thomas. "I used to think surviving was my punishment," he said finally. like God or the universe or whatever was making me stay alive to suffer for what I'd done. Elena nodded. I felt the same after Carlos died. Like breathing was betraying him somehow. But that's not it, is it? Sam looked at her, seeing understanding in her dark eyes. Surviving isn't the punishment. It's the chance to honor them, to live the kind of life they would have been proud of. Elena smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. To carry their memory forward instead of just carrying their death. They buried the gang in a common grave behind the mission, not out of respect, but because the desert sun would make the bodies a problem for anyone who came after. They said no words over the grave, offered no prayers for men who'd lived by violence and died by it. Some deaths didn't deserve mourning. But they stood together for a long moment at the place where Sam had fallen, where his blood had darkened the ancient stones. Not in mourning, but in gratitude. Gratitude that he'd found the courage to stand when it mattered. Gratitude that Elena had been there to help him find it. Gratitude that some stories could end in redemption instead of just revenge. What now? Sam asked as they saddled their horses in the growing heat of the day. Elena adjusted her hat and looked north toward the Rio Grande in Texas and whatever lay beyond. Now we go home. You to yours, me to mine. And then we live. She swung up in her saddle with that easy grace he'd come to admire. We wake up each morning and choose to honor the dead by being fully alive. We help people when we can, fight injustice when we find it, love without holding back because we know how quickly it can be taken away. Sam mounted his own horse, his shoulder protesting, but holding. The bay gelding felt solid beneath him, ready for whatever road lay ahead. Think we'll see each other again? Elena smiled. The world's not as big as it seems, Samuel McKenzie. And people who understand each other have a way of finding their paths crossing. They rode north together until they reached a fork in the trail, one branch leading northeast toward Sweetwater and Sam's ranch, the other northwest toward Elena's burned farm and whatever she would build from its ashes. They sat their horses at the junction, neither in any hurry to say goodbye to someone who'd helped them find their way back to life. Elena, Sam said finally, thank you. For what? For seeing something in me worth saving. For believing I could be better than my worst moment. Elena leaned over and touched his good hand briefly. Thomas believed it too. He was just waiting for you to see it yourself. She rode away without looking back, and Sam watched her go until she was just a speck against the vast horizon. Then he turned his horse toward home, toward the ranch that had stood empty for 3 years while he wandered in his guilt. He had work to do there. Fences to mend, cattle to tend, a life to build that would make Thomas proud. The sun climbed higher as he rode, warming his face and shoulders. His wound ached, but it was the good kind of ache that reminded him he was alive, truly alive for the first time since that day in Sweetwater. He had purpose now, and peace, and the knowledge that some debts to the dead could only be paid by the living. Behind him, the mission of San Rafael stood empty again, but somehow it felt less broken than it had before. Like maybe faith could return to places where justice had been done and courage had been found. Like maybe broken things could be made whole again, given enough time and love and the will to try. Sam McKenzie rode toward the rising sun, carrying his scars, but no longer carrying his shame, understanding at last what Elena had meant about borrowed time and what the living owed to those who could no longer choose how to spend their days.